Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of George Washington, and the focus is his second term. The year is 1793, March 4th, it's his second inaugural, and this one's very different from his first. There's no fireworks, there's no big celebration. In fact, when Washington gives his inaugural address, it's the shortest ever, 135 words, and he's straight back to work. He was really conscious of sort of this tension and balance between pomp and circumstance and what is right and appropriate for the executive leader of a republic based on democratic principles, and in this case, he thought it was appropriate to tone things down. Now, the biggest policy issue hanging over from Washington's first term is foreign policy, and it has to do with, again, relations with France and the French Revolution, which continues to spiral out of control. Governments are churning. The Marquis de Lafayette, Washington's favorite, who had fought side by side with him in the Revolutionary War, he's been imprisoned. It's chaos. It's bloody. In the cabinet, Washington's cabinet, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, is insisting that Washington stands by the French. After all, they had stood by the Americans in the Revolutionary War with Britain, and Jefferson, who had spent time as the minister to France, feels this kinship for their revolutionary movement. But Washington recognizes that this is not the time for the United States to take sides. This is a fragile new country, and the last thing that the United States needed was to get in a fight with one, because if he aligned with either France or England as they're battling each other and all the different sides jockeying for power in France, hard to pick which side was going to win out, and he'd be creating enemies. So Washington issues a Neutrality Proclamation in which he states to pursue a conduct friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers, while at the same time refraining from committing, aiding, or abetting hostilities against any of the said powers. This neutrality approach actually would become U.S. doctrine for 100 years to try to stay out of these entangling alliances and picking sides with allies or foes, not in the best interest of the United States. Nevertheless, very unpopular with a lot of Americans, including Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who continues to try to push and prod, but Washington is unmoved. The official policy of the United States is neutrality. Well, somebody steps into the mix, and it's the new ambassador from France, Edmund Genet, and he comes to the United States to rally the Francophiles to support France against England in their battle overseas. And he is unmoved by Washington's proclamation of neutrality. In fact, again, he goes directly to the people trying to rally their support. And Washington is feeling, as President of the United States, that the country's sovereignty is actually at risk for this rabble-rousing foreigner who's coming in and trying to foment support for a cause that he has already said we're going to stay out of. So Washington meets with Genet. It doesn't go well. Even Jefferson finds Genet off-putting, and eventually the administration calls for his recall, and Genet is replaced. He actually stays in the United States, because if he goes back to France, he's probably going to be killed in the chaos going on in the French Revolution, so he sort of seeks asylum in the U.S., but his mission comes to an end. But again, it continues to bring up these tough, difficult decisions and animosity within the cabinet with respect to foreign policy. The cabinet is almost fractured to a point of no return, where Hamilton and Jefferson are almost at each other's throats. It's not only policy-wise, it's personal. Washington is at his wit's end. He's writing letters to both of them to try to get them to come to terms with each other. And he writes to Jefferson, "How unfortunate. How much to be regretted then, that while we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, internal dissension should be harrowing and tearing our vitals. My earnest wish and fondest hope, therefore, is that instead of wounding suspicions and irritating charges, there may be liberal allowances, mutual forbearances, and temporizing yielding on all sides. Without them, everything must rub. The wheels of government will clog, our enemies will triumph." He's trying everything he can. It doesn't work. Falls on deaf ears. Jefferson blames Hamilton. Hamilton blames Jefferson. The whole thing is basically falling apart. And at the end of the year, Jefferson resigns, effectively to go back to Virginia to become the leader of the opposition. Now, in the next year, Washington has a different kind of conflict to deal with, and it's actually a rebellion within the United States emanating from Western Pennsylvania, and the topic is whiskey. Part of Alexander Hamilton's economic plan was to put a tax on whiskey to raise funds. What I guess he didn't realize is that whiskey was really important to wheat farmers in Pennsylvania and other parts in the frontier. Why? Because it was uneconomical for them to transport wheat to the eastern markets, but they could transport whiskey. They would take the wheat, they would convert it into whiskey, and that was economical, and now they were being taxed heavily. They didn't like it, they were riling up, they were threatening the officials in the state of Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania government wasn't taking any action. Now, Washington believes first and foremost in his responsibility as the chief executive to enforce the law. People may disagree with the law, you can change the law, but while it's on the books, he's going to enforce it. And there had been a rebellion prior to the Constitution, Shays' Rebellion, that was also again over taxes. This was in Massachusetts. And Washington was appalled that the federal government took no action to try to repress it, which was, of course, much more difficult under the Articles of Confederation. He believed he's fully empowered by the Constitution to go suppress this rebellion. So that's what he does. He supports the raising of 13,000 militiamen to go out with him in the saddle, the only president in American history to actually take men into battle, in this case on U.S. soil, to suppress this rebellion. Now, it's September of 1794. Washington is in full uniform. Other Revolutionary War generals and officers are with him to go make this fight. He doesn't actually go into battle. He leaves, goes back to Washington, lets the others take control. And in fact, there is no battle because with this huge amount of force, the dissidents that were upset actually just dissipate into the mist, and everything kind of comes to an end. Two interesting motions. One is not a precedent, one is. There's no precedent for a commander-in-chief to actually take the field in uniform for battle. Washington almost does that. No other president follows in American history. But there is a precedent to suppress rebellion. And Washington's actions put the country on notice that if you're not going to obey the laws and you're threatening the safety and stability of the United States, the federal government would act. And that was a precedent and a warning that Washington put into place. Now back to foreign policy, where England and France now are in a full-fledged war. The U.S. is caught in the middle. England and France are both performing depredations on American ships in the high seas. England is worse in that they're impressing Americans that they're claiming to be British, and they're literally boarding ships saying, you're a Brit, we're taking you and forcing you to serve in the British Navy. Washington is trying to figure out what to do, so he sends John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to England, and he actually has James Monroe go to France as the new minister. Try to come up with some agreement on either side. Well, Jay is successful, sort of successful. He negotiates a treaty. He gets no concessions on impressment. He gets no concessions on what the Southerners want in terms of return of slaves that had been escaped during the Revolutionary War. There's no help there. But he does get an economic agreement, and for now at least, the idea of going to war with England is put aside. So Washington supports the Jay Treaty. He submits it to the Senate. There's a big uproar. It passes by a single vote, but many are not happy. They think it's a sellout to England, who had been their enemy. It's against France. Thomas Jefferson, again, leading the voice of the opposition against the monarchists and the Anglo-men who are favoring Britain in the administration. And poor James Monroe, who actually believes more with the France side of things, is kind of hung out to dry, where he's in France. He's giving some support to France. The Washington administration doesn't like what he's saying. They think he's going beyond the issue of neutrality. He's recalled, and he breaks with George Washington. So Jefferson is broken with Washington. Monroe is broken with Washington. James Madison is next. These are three presidents to come, all Virginians, that all break with Washington in his second term. Because Madison believes that the House of Representatives has a role in the treaty approval process. And Washington says that's nonsense. I was at the Constitutional Convention too, and there was nothing about the House having any say in treaties. That is entirely to the Senate. Madison comes up with this idea, well, that appropriations bills need to come out of the House first, and they can't actually implement the treaty without money. So therefore, convoluted logic, the House has a say, and the House is demanding papers, all the papers from the administration about the Jay Treaty. And Washington says no. He says no for two reasons. One, he is adamant that his memory is correct. There is no authority whatsoever for the House on treaties, and he's not going to give in on this one to give them more power than the Constitution does. But he also claims he's the first president to claim what we now call executive privilege. He says that there's reasons why some papers should not be delivered to Congress. And he says the nature of foreign negotiations requires caution, and their success must often depend on secrecy. A full disclosure of all the measures, demands, or eventual concessions which may have been proposed or contemplated would be extremely impolitic. To admit then a right in the House of Representatives to demand and to have as a matter of course all the papers respecting a negotiation with a foreign power would be to establish a dangerous precedent. A just regard to the Constitution and to the duty of my office forbids a compliance with your request. And so he doesn't deliver the papers. Executive privilege is started. It's not in the Constitution. It's a give and take in reality between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And it's been an argument for over 200 years as to which one is right, but Washington put his stake in the ground. Well, Washington is finally coming to the end of his second term, and he is definitely tired and ready to go. He'd been a victim in the press and in public arguments, vilifying him in a way that he had really never experienced before. And while others had talked him into continuing to serve previously, he was effectively done. So just before leaving, he actually issues a farewell document in which he gives some suggestions to the American citizenry to consider for going forward. But that is the story for another day. Because that is George Washington and his second term from the life of George Washington. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.